So without further ado, I will introduce Professor David Guile. David first became interested in the changing relationship between education and work while working as a deputy head teacher in Tower Hamlets in England in the late 1980s, and trying to support young people to either enter the labour market or progress to college for further study before entering the labour market. In both cases, he realised that students, their parents and teachers all held ideas about the nature of work available in London, which was task-based, manual and regimented, which is a very different idea of work from work that is team-based, interpersonal and accountable. So in an attempt to support students, their parents and teachers understand the changing nature of work, the type of careers available and the necessary qualifications, he introduced a work experience program or scheme. Gradually, David became more interested in theorising the transition to work, the relationship between subjects and careers, and how work could be designed to facilitate learning. These interests led David to leave his previous career and commence a new one as a research officer on the first work-based learning project at the Institute of Education, which was led by Professor Michael Young. Over the last 20 years, a long and illustrious career, David, he has gradually developed an interdisciplinary framework based on sociology, sociocultural theories, and to analyse the twin issues of the changing relationship between education and work, and between changes in work and workplace learning. These ideas are contained in his book, The Learning Challenge of the Knowledge Economy, and also the edited collection with David Livingstone, The Knowledge Economy and Lifelong Learning, Critical Perspectives. Recently, he has established a Centre for Engineering Education to diversify the context where he can pursue his theoretical and methodological interests. His lecture today focuses on changes in work and their potential implications for researching work and learning, with specific reference to the history and the concerns of this conference. David, would you like to come and join us? And please welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start and thank the International Organising Committee for the invitation to give the lecture, and also all our Singaporean hosts who've made this week a really fantastic experience, I think, as Helen indicated in her comments. You're going to have to give me a minute while I just adjust to the logistics of this. Right, okay. Right. The invitation to speak at the conference led me to ask myself the following question: how did this conference come into existence, and what challenges might it confront researching work and learning in the future? And it seemed to me that they may be issues that are also going to be of interest to everybody else. So to consider some, because obviously it's a very big question and I cannot possibly claim to address all of it, to consider some of those aspects, what I've chosen to do is what I put a structure together. Can you hear me when I do that? I suddenly go off mic and I'm not sure whether it's okay, all right. Nobody's saying no, so I'll assume until somebody waves at me, everything's okay. To address some of those aspects of that question, I put the following structure together. And I'm going to start with what I call a schematic genealogy of how RWL came into existence, which, given that there are some people who have been there since the start in the audience, and many of you who've come at a much later stage, hopefully that'll be of interest in its own terms, but also be of interest in terms of thinking about where what you've been experiencing here in Singapore over the last couple of days. But I want to also argue that one issue, possibly the future of work, has got a bit lost in the conference along the way, and I want to explain and tease out really from the genealogy why that is. But it's not a question of people doing anything wrong. It's just sometimes when you focus intensely on one set of issues, you sometimes kind of lose focus a little bit on other sets of issues. So I'm going to present, having made that argument, 3 scenarios for the way work might develop in the future. Look at the implications of those, and then conclude by inviting the conference to decide whether it feels that they're relevant in your particular context, because obviously you're an international audience, and what I'm going to present is something which is a snapshot, but you'll have to situate it in relation to the concerns and challenges you face back home. Now, I have to admit, I was not at the first RWL. In fact, as I said to Miriam Zoukas when I was talking to her about this, I didn't even know the first RWL existed, which, given that I was in England at the time, is a sad state of affairs of how the Institute of Education was, because I don't think anybody at the Institute of Education attended either. But what I chose to do to put the genealogy together was to kind of use the following 3 sources of data, and I'm not going to read through every one, but you can see how I've done it, plus my own memory of attending 5, and this is now the 6th conference out of the 9. And having actually spoken to a host of people, and I don't really want to name everybody because it's a bit unfair, but I do want to say one thing about Miriam, and that is she has the most amazing archive. So if I do this with my hands, that's about the width of the proceedings from the first conference, which I took home with me and read through. And it's an amazing artifact of actually the number of papers that were actually written in advance. It was full papers that were written for that conference. Okay, so people were enormously serious and committed. I'm not suggesting you aren't, of course, but I mean, they were really serious. They wanted to establish this conference in a very thorough and professional way. So, using the triangulation methodology between the interviews, my recollections, reading the special editions of the Journal of Workplace Learning, and also looking at conference proceedings and so forth, I've kind of tried to tease out a history. It's a potted history, of course, but I'm trying to pick out some key moments and issues. Okay, and but the starting point for all of this, before we get to RWL, is actually the Department of Adult and Continuing Education in Leeds University. Now, as it sort of acknowledges on the slide there, Leeds University has at that time, things have changed slightly, but then they have for adult education around the world, a fantastic rich history since the Second World War in the UK, with all kinds of issues to do with adult education. But there was a key kind of development in the late 80s in the department, which are the 2 quotes from Keith Forrester, who played a really important part pre-RWL amongst adult education networks, along with trade union educators and so forth, as well as in those early conferences. And you get a flavour of the concerns from the quotation, that there's a very kind of political orientation there, that it was a reaction to the early impact of neoliberal policies in education, adult education in particular, but also a recognition from the mid-80s onwards that maybe there could be a new kind of relationship between universities and actually people in workplaces, and possibly the route for that was actually through trade union educators, so there was a kind of can we close the gap between theory and practice, the isolation of the academy from the actual kind of field of practices, or a range of practices really. And I think that's an important starting point, and I'll kind of come back to that later. But in parallel, there was also, as has been explained to me, a lot of ideas, and various people in the room, including David Bowd. I can't quite see you, David, but I'm sure you're around somewhere. There's a whole set of ideas about learning at work, work-based learning and so forth, situated learning, that arose in a similar period. And there's a kind of confluence to some extent between those ideas and the political concerns that led the colleagues at Leeds and their international connections, because Leeds was very well connected with the adult education community globally. I suppose those days it was called internationally. Perhaps globalisation, the lexicon of globalisation hadn't quite established itself as fully as it has done today. And what it led them to do was to actually organise adult education international conferences styled on academic lines. But of course, if you've never really run those kinds of conferences, they're actually quite a challenge. Once you start to run them, you develop a capability, capacity, a motivation, and a sense of inspiration about what else might be possible. Okay? possibly other people in this room in other settings have been through sort of a similar process yourself. So the colleagues eventually came together, and Leeds said to themselves, as Miriam has told me, and if Keith was here, he would say this, we will lead on this. We will instigate this first RWL conference, because we think it's really important to look at the issues with our international colleagues to do with the way in which work and learning is changing, and how we might sort of think about it and work together more effectively internationally, rather than just working in our kind of slightly siloized, country-specific silos. Okay. Now, I think what's really interesting is to take a look, and I'm not going to read through them, I'm just going to ask you to kind of dwell on them for a moment, is to look at the themes from the first conference and kind of trace them back to my observation about Keith Forrester's quotation about the changing relationship between work, role of trade unions. And you get a sense from the themes that actually, there are only 5 themes, sorry, I can't see properly, 5 themes. But there's a very clear kind of strong political theme that's kind of our undercurrent that's there, okay. But at the same time, as you're going to see, there were other issues that were also surfacing. So the conference came about deciding to be eclectic in terms of the kinds of issues it would address. From a theoretical perspective, substantively, theoretically, and methodologically, in all these different kinds of ways. And that eclecticism, you can see if you look at the, as I've been able to do, at the original conference proceedings, you can see that coming through in terms of the theoretical approaches. And there's a range of theoretical approaches that I've outlined there. And for some of you who may be less familiar with them, I've kind of just dropped in the odd author, just to try to show that diversity was really a hallmark of what people were actually trying to do, the resources they were trying to draw on in order to actually think about the work and learning issues. Interestingly, though, from a methodological point of view, most of the work was predominantly qualitative, with the honourable exception of the Toronto School, and the representatives will know why that is. But I think what I found most intriguing on reading through the papers, which were obviously written separate from one another in isolation, because the community kind of knew itself in one sense, but in another sense, they hadn't actually yet met. But what I could trace out were some really interesting tensions. I just want to dwell on these a moment. And when I use the word tension, I don't mean that in any negative sense. I think this is kind of the intellectual kind of intriguing part of the conference, but also it's about the practically intriguing part of the conference. So there was a clear tension between the traditional adult educator or worker educator commitment to education external to the workplace, which was developing workers as active citizens to engage in participatory democracy and so forth, and the emerging human capital impetus, very much at that time in the form of the learning organisation, okay, which some of the papers actually kind of used that term and kind of was a kind of a frame of reference that was apparent in the conference, to support learning through and at work to enhance firms' competitiveness as well as workers' employability. So you can see there's the kind of should education come outside to serve a particular set of purposes, or should it be much more vocationally orientated? That tension was there right from the outset. Equally, another tension that comes through is that the adult education theories of learning were very much used to actually support, the ones that advocated forms of emancipation, were used very much to support and reinforce and analyse the forms of worker democracy and I don't know what happened to the "and" there, and social justice, it should have said. But anyway, I think I must have been editing at the last minute and lost the other term. But also the emerging social cultural theories. I would say retrospectively looking at it, there might have been some suspicion about whether they were going to be helpful or not. Because to some extent there was a sense that maybe they were going to actually, they lent themselves, not they were obviously designed to do this, but they maybe have been perceived to have lent themselves to actually supporting the human capital agenda, which was part of the other element of tradition within the conference. Now, it's very difficult to go through history in a short period of time, because obviously I want to accomplish some other objectives with the lecture. So having set the scene in that kind of way as regards the first conference in Leeds. What I've chosen to do until we get to Singapore, when we will come back to something kind of rather similar to the framework I've just used to set up Leeds, I'm actually drawing on quotations from several people who commented in different kinds of ways on the conferences. Sometimes they're comments that came from conference proceedings, sometimes they came from the editorials in the Journal of Workplace Learning, and the authors are duly named. And what they show is that those tensions kind of rather like have ebbed and flowed in different ways through the conference, but new issues have come in, and sometimes the tensions have been reframed in quite profoundly new and important ways. So the Calgary conference, I think, very much continues in the same kind of vein, and I think you capture a sense of that from John Bratton and Peter Sawchuk's quotation there. That you can see, without me repeating what I said to begin with, you can kind of see the kind of the parallel. Where I think you start to see kind of a slightly interesting difference in terms of themes and issues and preoccupations within RWL is when you actually arrive at the conference in Tampere. And the quotation there indicates that I think that the sense that the work-learning interface should be seen as part of something akin to a national innovation system, where there are stakeholders who are all contributing in equal and different ways. Doesn't mean to say that it's an uncontested form of contribution, but that was very much part and parcel of the flavour of that particular conference. Now, I'm skipping Sydney. I don't want anybody who was at Sydney or associated with the organising of it to think that I've missed out because I've forgotten about it. I'm going to come back in a moment. I think the South African conference, though, did introduce a very different kind of set of frames for thinking about the work-learning interface. Okay? I think you need to dwell on the quote from Shirley Walters and Linda Cooper to kind of capture the flavour of what they were trying to do within the Working Learning Conference. You could, if we echo a little bit of the language from Raywin's keynote on Monday, there was a definite attempt to ensure that the Global South agenda surfaced within the body of work within the conference, and it wasn't quite as skewed as in all fairness, it probably had been in the first three to looking at predominantly northern preoccupations. Yet, having said this, by the time we get to the Roskilde conference, something that, because I went to Sydney, well, some of the early ones as well, but at Sydney it became very apparent, and it was a theme that started to rise throughout the period of time, from, I suppose, with Tampere through Sydney, and then a little bit South Africa as well, but very apparent at Roskilde, as Henning Olsen's quote indicates, that there was now a concern to look at professional learning in all those different forms. And if you think about what you've experienced in the conference in the course of the last 3 days, you can see that that's a theme that's also very much a feature now of RWL. And when we arrive in Shanghai, we can see that in Shanghai there's equally a concern to retain that sort of innovation system perspective that's referred to, not quite in those languages, but I think the words basically cover that. And the Sterling Conference very much leaves us with a return to, through this intriguing notion of making the visible invisible in workplace work and in learning, very much returns to some of the earlier themes. So what you can see over time is that a whole range of issues have kind of circled around, asserted themselves at different points in time, but it allows this richness that actually has become the RWL conference to exist and endure and thrive. Now we arrive in Singapore, and I want to go back to the same kind of framework that I actually used for Leeds at the start. So look at the conference themes, and very quickly we're going to go back to Leeds. And you get a sense, just from looking at the words, of how the conference is obviously reflecting the global changes that are going on, because migration issues are clearly not part of the Leeds agenda in the way that they have been here, and obviously they started at an early point in time in the conferences as well. The theoretical approaches, some have endured and new ones have come on stream. So without mentioning again the ones that were there to begin with, but the socio-material, the social practice theory, the socio-cognitive theory, Foucauldian theory, you can see a whole new range of perspectives coming in. So that theoretical diversity is very, very apparent in the conference when you, traditions when you look at it. But equally, there's a much more diverse methodological approach these days. But a lot of the methodologies are actually about tools or instruments to do things. They're kind of supporting specific interventions in workplaces and work settings, as opposed to the kind of the more broader framing of methodology, thinking about how to operationalize theory in some kind of way to conduct large-scale pieces of research. But I think that for me, what's particularly striking in this little genealogy, and this is going to be the point where we just kind of conclude, and I sort of get to move on to another part of the presentation, is that the perspectives in working and learning, as they say there, within this conference, have very much kind of retained the human capital orientation that I spoke about. Although it is noticeable, of course, there are still some tensions, and I've flicked up the three that seem to me, from attending, listening to the conversations, and looking also at the conference proceedings, the three key ones where we can see tensions around employment, migration, and recognition. I don't want to dwell on those, but just to sort of give you a flavour of the tensions that were with Leeds abated a little bit, and they manifest themselves in a new kind of way. So I suppose the question I was left with, having gone through this, was, is this a similar or a different picture that we're actually looking at within the conference? And I kind of concluded, well, in some ways it is similar, because obviously there's a clear family of resemblances, and that they reflect the original theoretical and methodological diversity that the conference was actually trying to achieve. But it's also different, okay, to some extent, because obviously there's an identification of the benefits of research for workers and learners of firms and policymakers here in Singapore, and a little less maybe about the purpose of actually researching work and learning. Some of those fundamental questions that maybe the Leeds conference and perhaps the early couple of ones kicked off with. Now, why would this be? Well, in a sense, it's almost understandable, because if you have an eclectic conference and that is hosted in different parts of the world, there's not just the organising committee that are actually part and parcel of shaping the conferences, there are also the host institutions and the host country and their preoccupations, as much as you as attendees through your research work. So inevitably, it's going to kind of take this kind of really intriguing, kind of changing kind of shape and character. But has anything been lost sight of? Okay, and I want to actually make the case that maybe something has been lost sight of. And when I say lost sight, I don't mean, as I said at the start, I'm being critical. It's just that when you gaze intensively on something, when you're doing any kind of social scientific research, clearly some objects become a central concern and others are kind of get played down a little bit. And I actually want to play up something in this, from this next kind of part of the presentation. And that's the issue about the future of work. But I recognise that, of course, there has been, throughout all the RWL conferences, the odd paper or two, sometimes more than that, where people have raised the way in which work is changing, or might change, perhaps it's a combination of both. But what I want to do is use Uriel Engström's typology, because he's presented at the conference on a couple of times, and in all fairness to Uriel, probably was the first person to kind of make that argument within the body of the conference. But also because the typology I want to actually suggest that there's maybe another way of looking at some of the aspects of the modes of production that Uriel thinks are changing in a particular way. So we're going to go and take a look at that now. We are. Yes, we are. Now, for those of you who don't necessarily come from a social scientific background, looking at a typology that shows effectively, if you count them, 6 modes of production, and I'm not going to read through each one, but I mean, I'll just, each line, but I'll just kind of pick out craft, mass production, lean production, mass customization, innovation-driven production, co-configuration, social production. If you look at a typology, at first sight, it's very easy to think, well, everything now is like the box at the, or the, not quite the box, the kind of the L shape at the top, okay. But that's, of course, not actually Uriel's argument or how he's supposed to use a typology. The argument is that the modes of production probably all still exist in different kind of ways, in different combinations, at different points of time in many societies, so perhaps in some societies more than others. But what Uriel was trying to highlight, though, when he introduced this, was that perhaps it would be a helpful way, a heuristic, to think about the changing relationship between work and the forms of organisation that was actually associated with it. So I'm just going to dwell on two aspects of the typology so that you get a flavour of what he was trying to do before moving on to the argument that I actually want to make, having used that as a kind of a base. So if you look at mass customisation, where the mode of organisation at work is modularisation, in other words, breaking things down into discrete entities, but there is some element of customer involvement. For Uriot, that's kind of a a particular characteristic of how work might be organised in certain kind of industries. Think kind of maybe the car industry, okay? The modularisation of cars and feedback from customers being taken account of in the learning process in order to actually produce the designs of future automobiles. And social production, where I suppose the example he always uses most consistently is the development of Linux software and open source software, which actually became a resource that could be used away from proprietorial systems, and therefore gave people who wanted to be both developers of software and users of software far greater resources and freedom to do so than being locked into particular proprietorial systems. So you can see that what he's trying to highlight is if you think about work in these kinds of ways, you can actually start to ask new kinds of questions about how it's organised, why it's changing, what learning opportunities might exist, and so forth. Now, he does present those three in a very positive light. And what I actually want to say is not that he's wrong, but actually there are three recent books that actually present, in the case of the last three, modularisation, co-configuration, and social production, very different interpretations or perspectives on them. And these are the books, okay. If anybody's read them, great, you can have a talk to me about them afterwards. If you haven't, I hope when I actually introduce you to their arguments that you'll find them of interest and that they're going to be a provocative and useful source for you in research that you're doing. So what I'm saying basically is that I think it might be helpful to think about the future of work by taking a look at the argument contained in these three books, and then later on thinking about the implications for RWL. Right, here we go. So what I've done is I've assembled a typology in order to actually analyse the three books and share them with you, given that they're quite thick. It's kind of a skeletal sharing, so you have to kind of, if anybody's read them in any one of the books in detail, you'll have to forgive the way I skate over some of the arguments, okay? And that's a description of how I've actually pulled the typology together. Now, the first book, Martin Ford's book, which actually was only just published this year, 2015, okay, just to go back to remind you of the title, The Rise of the Robots. I forgot to put the rest of the title in for some reason, which is and mass unemployment. Now I'm going to dwell a little bit more slowly on these so that I actually don't so that I don't race over just the analytical part, and then we can speed up a little bit in a moment. Ford argues basically that the purpose of work is to produce goods and services efficiently and effectively. In that sense, he's a completely unabashed kind of free marketeer. Okay. His economic assumptions very much a neoclassical perspective on work in the economy in the kind of ways there. He sees sectors still in traditional terms and so forth. And what you get from Ford's book, interestingly, is a version of what Engerstrom calls mass customization. But it loses the optimistic shine or potential that sits in the Engerstrom typology. It's quite bleak in contrast, because it's characterized by the increasing deployment of robotic technology. Now, of course, when I first read the book, and from the title, I kind of thought he had in mind the sort of little creatures that you sometimes see sketched out, you know, as a robot. He doesn't really mean that, okay? There's an element of that there, but basically what he's talking about is the use of algorithms in smart software, okay, that allows, as we're going to see in accordance to his argument, forms of machine learning, an interesting term, okay? But it's monitored by small cadres of technical and professional staff. So for Ford, it's inevitable, it's a very technological deterministic account in many ways, it's inevitable that basically human beings will be displaced by machines for profit. Okay? Although he does have a moral conscience, as you will see. He's not completely an unabashed free marketeer. So a really good example of what he might mean is the way that production lines in any kind of automobile company have been completely taken over by robotics, as with, you know, the classic hollowing out effect that's been referred to in factories. And also, and one could even think about universities in this sense, the way that many back office functions have become automated, and there's been people have been made redundant. But the resources for work, and these are the issues that Ford particularly wants to direct our attention to, are what he calls machine learning, and by which he means artificial intelligence deployed to, and this is, I want to really emphasize this point, because I'm not saying when I do this I agree with him, just to kind of see the force of his argument, okay? Artificial intelligence deployed to analyze and write reports on electronic documents. That's what he means by learning. Okay. So in other words, that the software's been written so that it could actually tell you what it found in the document, not just to filter it and then leave it for us to take over, okay, and do that work. And the other issue, of course, then he says about, as a resource for work is humans and machines will continue to refine and create new software and data. So there's a limited number of people working together. From Ford's perspective, which is an unabashed, as I said, kind of capitalist perspective, one of the consequences, of course, if there's mass unemployment, is there's no demand in the economy. So that would sound like the edifice of capitalism would have to crash down. Of course, for Ford, it's not going to happen, because what he's going to say in contrast is that although there will be limits to growth and there'll be mass unemployment, we can't have that scenario. So this is his moral commitment, is that effectively employers and politicians will have to find a way to create a living wage. Now, there's a whole big argument in there, and as I said, I'm skating over it. I just want to focus in on all three of these, are actually not around the fullness of the argument, just around the work implications. Okay. Now we come to the second book. Sorry, I'll go back just to remind you of the title. Cognitive Capitalism by Jan Mulier-Butang. Now, what's interesting I thought about this was Mulier-Butang is a Marxist, but who's actually writing about, I think in quite an interesting way, about the form of capitalism that exists in various parts of the world at this point in time. Okay. And you see the difference straight away, even though it is a kind of a slightly favourable counter-capitalism from Ford. Okay. The purpose of work is to innovate continually in production processes by capturing externalities. What he means by that is potential ways to facilitate improvement or the creation of new products and services, and obviously by extension profit. But this is where he differs from Ford, Mulier-Butang. He sees a very different relation. He doesn't see production and consumption as separate. He sees them as actually conjoined in various kinds of ways. And this is how he kind of theorizes it. He says the economic assumption, he's using a cognitive economic assumption, which is a kind of a new creation of his own to some extent. Oh, here's another colleague, sorry, I should have actually acknowledged that there's a whole body of work amongst his French economists who contributed to the ideas that underpin the book. So his argument is there's an integration of the market production and non-market consumption via the form of collective cognitive interaction. Okay. So what does he mean by this? Because sometimes the people kind of bandy terms around, and when you actually sort of strip them to their essence, you find it's been very much as it was all along. It's just that this is a kind of fancy new term that's been introduced. But he is actually trying to force the case that that's not true. So he says collective cognitive interaction is a form of immaterial labour. Okay. That is an activity not directly concerned with production that firms could use to enhance their own or other firms' products and services. Now, the strength of the book is it's very theoretically sophisticated. Its limitation is there's very few empirical examples of the case that's being made. So I thought the most easy one for people to kind of possibly use, oh my goodness, 10 minutes, okay, right. I'm going to have to do some severe editing, okay. But 10 minutes is a little bit better than I thought, because I left some time for some questions, okay. Which maybe will have to be shouting at me afterwards. If you think about the way that Amazon, when you use it, gives you and other people have, etc. So that's a very vivid example of other customers have bought because basically the algorithms have actually been encoded in such a way that they can filter and sift and present to you things that you might like. But of course, the consumption behavior is, in Mulier-Butang's terms, is immaterial labor, because what they'll do is Amazon is benefiting from our consumption patterns by actually processing them in a way to convert them into something that's valuable as work. Okay. Now, we come to the third perspective, Okay, and that's Rifkin's book, Zero Marginal Utility, which I prefer to refer to it as actually the Internet of Things. Now, Rifkin is for those of you who may, because he's very widely read and commented on, you may know him, or of him. What he has staked out territory for about 20 years now is actually arguing that basically the planet is under threat. So therefore, all forms of work will ultimately have to be about sustaining life on the planet. It's a completely different kind of conception. And you can see that he's got an argument about a hybrid economy, which is part neoclassical economics, because he still sees aspects of capitalism working effectively, but also he introduces this phrase, the collaborative commons. Okay, I'll leave you to read the quote, but I'll explain, while you're doing that, let's explain what the collaborative commons is. Rifkin is arguing that it really the argument kind of comes off the open source software kind of traditions, that actually information technology is being connected in all kinds of ways through the web. And that at the same time, what's happening is that there's a communication network, but the communication network becomes a logistical network. In other words, we can start to see how to move goods and services electronically. And he's got lots of vivid examples of how sensors and tagging allow people to kind of track, or will allow people to track more effectively where things are. The environmental part of his argument is actually the energy, because Rifkin puts massive emphasis actually on the fact that he thinks that we will all have to design buildings that ultimately generate heat from the sun, whether it be in homes or whether it be in in buildings like this. And so he sees that that'll ultimately be a kind of a link, and all these things, because they'll be linked together through software, will provide what he calls this collaborative commons, which is a kind of a sharing economy threshold. Okay. So, if for Rifkin, the norm of work is going to be social entrepreneurship, because basically he sees, it's kind of slightly idealistic, but when we ground it in a few minutes' time, you'll see that there are some issues that are actually kind of quite important, I think, for how we think about the future of work. He sees social production in terms of social entrepreneurship ultimately becoming the main model for work in capitalist societies. You go to the challenge at the end where he says, the challenge is to move from mass employment, which he thinks will take 50 years for us to retrofit buildings so that we can survive against the challenges of global warming. And then thereafter, we won't have mass employment. We'll have employment. He's not as dystopian as Ford, but it'll be based around social entrepreneurship, responding to all forms of social, economic, and political concerns that are actually arising in different societies. I'm going to skip over the rest of it because otherwise we'll lose a little bit. Now, in case anybody thinks, with me saying all this about these three writers, is this some flight of fantasy of David's, in which case, has he just gone away and read 3 books and really, it's a lovely lecture today. But this quote comes from The Observer, an English newspaper, from the 29th to the 11th of 15. It is in effect all those 3 arguments. I mean, I couldn't have found a more useful way of bringing it together for you this afternoon if I'd have planned it, okay? Because in effect, the paper is actually drawn on all the ideas in the books saying there's major challenges about the future of work, okay? And so I don't think it is completely a fantasy of mine. I think it's a lot more grounded, okay? So I kind of think what might be useful to do is to actually ask whether there's been any engagement in these issues in RWL, or whether there should be. And so I'm going to put it slightly more crudely than actually it is on the PowerPoint presentation, so I can skip on a bit. So I think it might be quite useful to look at 3 trends, all right, that come from those 3 scenarios. And then I'm going to extrapolate from those and some issues about learning in future research work. Now, robotics. Going back to Ford's argument, and this is a practical example or illustration of what's actually happening at the present time, and it's not an established major trend, but it's there and it could well become a major trend, okay? What I forgot to mention, I think, when I was doing Ford, there was a piece of software that this relates to, which is called e-discovery. And what e-discovery software does is it actually, it means that it will read through reports and then write what is significant about the reports. So with respect to the lovely line from yesterday about the Singaporean colleagues not wanting to read volumes of reports, if you want the solution to that from, from Ford's perspective, you just have e-discovery. So, but what's happening in various law firms in the States is that they're using e-discovery. So what they're doing is they're displacing lawyers, because you don't need the lawyers to do the initial sift of all the material. So what you have is a software that, as why I put it here, working with robots that make judgments. So this is somebody who's somebody has created the robot to make the judgment, of course. But the issue is that the software is making a judgment about data and possibly about you working with it, because it could be encoded to do both. Okay, and this is not a fantasy. That's actually in place. From the cognitarianism perspective, okay, teamwork to identify and incorporate externalities into products and services. I think I mentioned the automobile example earlier. The issue of design of cars is not just literally done by the R&D teams. The R&D teams are part of the design process, but increasingly it's the feedback from customers about the designs, about the comfort, about the visibility, about the function, the performance of the engines and so forth. The externality, as far as from Moulier Boutang's perspective, that gets incorporated into the design process. It's there. It sounds like a very fanciful argument when you first hear it, but it's a very grounded example of what's actually happening. And finally, the Internet of Things argument from Rifkin, okay? The self-employment and the generation of ideas and funding is clearly happening in all parts of the world. I've just chosen, because it's written up extensively in the digital creative literature. You've got Brooklyn and London, where there's been massive kind of developments of that sort of thing, where basically the paradigm for work has become self-employment or self-entrepreneurship. So I thought, well, okay, if we focus on that a minute, let's actually ask some questions and say, are we researching these kinds of things and these kinds of issues, and what kind of problems might we have if we've got these challenges in front of us? Because my perspective has always been, it's ill-advised to ignore changes in the world of work, because by and large what tends to happen is that what starts off as a minor change becomes established as a much more substantial trend over time. So the question is, can we use the current theoretical perspectives to do so? And what I'm going to do, since time is short, but I think we'll get through okay, is take you through three quite grounded examples, but in relation to three theoretical perspectives, or two theoretical perspectives and one concept, I think, to be actually accurate. Okay, so I've called this section the challenge of researching working and learning with machines that form judgments. Now, at this conference and other conferences, a common theoretical perspective for actually researching human-machine interaction is socio-material theory, or often sometimes called actor-network theory. Now, I know many people in the room will be familiar with this, but some of you won't, so I'm just going to make it clear the kind of the presuppositions of that theory, to kind of raise a couple of questions about whether it is going to be as helpful as it's been perceived to be in the future. So socio-material theory is predicated on the idea that the symmetricalization of humans and machines as actants, that's the kind of key word. In other words, we're not distinguishing between the human and the machine. We're calling them, they're both acting in some kind of way within a network, okay? So what's not being accorded a primacy in the social material perspective is the idea of human intentionality. But the question I'm posing is, because it's an extrapolation of Ford's argument, but is this assumption still applicable when we're researching software, and we might be researching software, that forms judgments, even challenges about human judgment? So think about the e-discovery example. Okay. So how would the lawyers feel if a bunch of researchers came in and started looking at what they were doing and saying, oh, actually, it's a symmetrical network here, when actually they were seeing potentially that the work they're doing it might be replaced by the form of technology that they're actually working with? So this is, now, of course, there was a whole understandable argument why Latour and others made the case about the fact that technology had been excluded from the perspective of many social theories. And it was completely valid, but by and large, the forms of technology that he and colleagues were looking at were quite benign compared with the kinds of technology robotic technology. So the question I kind of raised is this. And these are floating, by the way, they're not answered, any of these three questions. For the first one is, instead of actually continuing with socio-material theory, do we have to take more account of dissymmetry in networks by doing what Susan Lee Starr actually argued quite some years back now, is rediscovering what she called subject-object positionings, by which she means if we don't understand the difference between a human and a bit of software, even if it's kind of mimicking human qualities, then we're limiting ourselves when it comes to actually having any critical reflection on the machine, and also the implications for human learning of working with those kinds of machines. So I think there may be a kind of theoretical issue that we'll have to think about in relation to how we look at that kind of technology. Now, the next one, there we go, right, okay. Okay, the challenge of researching, working and learning, and from the Moulier-Boutang perspective, what I've called this is unintentional co-configuration. Because, as you're about to see, there's something happening in this form of co-configuration which is very different from the way that Engstrom and others have used the term, even though it is slightly co-configured. Okay. So a common theoretical framework for researching co-configuration is activity theory and the concept of networking. But networking is predicated on a shared or joint object of activity that can be rethought, redesigned. But is this assumption still applicable to unintentional configuration based on capturing externalities? So we're going back to the externality example of thinking about the way in which consumer actions and preferences are incorporated by Amazon into the Amazon business model. There's a form of co-configuration there because something we're doing, a bit of our immaterial labour, from Moulier-Boutang's terms, is actually being used to convert by a company to convert into their business process. But we're not active partners in that process of co-configuration, even though we're actually contributing to it. Okay. So the question really is, I think, do we not have to differentiate between different forms of co-configuration, those that have a material and have an immaterial dimension to them, and create new concepts to understand how the process of generating externalities, how we make it visible? Because at the moment, I bet most people don't really think about that aspect of their use of Amazon or any other kind of software facility, any of the services that, much as I'm a Mac user myself, that Mac actually makes available to us. And the third position is the working and learning and the self-generation of ideas and funding, which is the Rifkin argument about social entrepreneurship. Now, we've seen this at this conference, and it's very apparent at many other conferences, that entrepreneurship and contingent work is researched using the concept of precariousness. Now, the concept itself is actually predicated to some extent on welfare capitalism, social partnership, and permanent employment as the norm. But as you saw from my explanation of Rifkin's actually effectively saying that won't be the norm in the future. Now, whether we accept Rifkin's argument is overblown, overstated, but I was actually highlighting there's a heck of a lot of social entrepreneurship actually breaking out around the world. Okay, so it's not as though it's a part of the future which is a fantasy that may not happen. It's a reality. It's actually something that's occurring, and it's part of the diverse forms of work and learning that actually exist. Okay. But is this assumption still applicable in light of the Internet of Things making resources available that facilitate social production? Because once you have technologies and that actually are very cheap to actually pick up and use, you can actually produce all kinds of products and services. Now, Rifkin gives a really interesting example, and I've become slightly kind of curious about it. He gives the example of 3D technology. And maybe more people in the room know more about it than I do. But what 3D technology allows you to do, basically, is to produce body parts as much as actually to produce buildings. And it's in its infancy, but it's quite cheap. So there's a whole issue about you don't need a great company to provide the technology to you. Hence, Rifkin's the title of the book, Zero Marginal Utility. Once it's been produced, the cost of using it and reproducing it again is dropped quite dramatically. So it seems to me that there may well be some issues about social entrepreneurship and how people use those kinds of resources to actually create new forms of work, new products and services, or to replicate things that have existed for many years, but in new kinds of ways. Okay. So the question I was left with when I was thinking about this is, instead of actually saying it's an issue about precariousness, do we actually have to recognize that in the case of contingent work, it takes a variety of forms? Some of it may be very precarious for people, and some of the papers here have acknowledged that. But the social entrepreneurship where people are choosing to live a precarious life because actually they want to create new forms of working and new products and services, that's a rather different order. And I think that's something that maybe I'm hoping the conference might want to take a look at, but as a conference, but also for that to happen, you as researchers will probably have to pick it up as well. So, concluding remarks. What I've tried to do is 4 things. Pay tribute to the rich and diverse ways RWL's developed over the last 17 years, okay? Draw the conference's attention to 3 future scenarios of work and their new skill issues. Invite the conference to consider whether the scenarios should be a focus for research in future, that's in your research, and if so, in what way, and suggest ways to research those issues, some of the challenges that you might face if you're going to turn, as we all would, to extant concepts and theories to try to help. What I've not tried to do, I've not tried to present the scenarios as inevitable or as uncontestable. As I said, there were 3 perspectives. They're there to kind of heuristically to kind of trigger an argument or a debate. Okay. I'm not assuming that the 3 perspectives will unfold in identical ways in different regimes of capitalism or in the global north and the global south. But arguably, they will play out in the global north and the global south in one way or another. I don't think they'll be precluded, okay, from playing out. I've not touched upon the implications for the argument for gender, ethnicity, and so forth, because it was just impossible to include that. And I've not addressed the implications for skills policies in national societies. Okay,